Dr. James Walker wasn't just a scientist, he was an explorer of the unknown. While others focused on safe, predictable research, he thrived on pushing boundaries. His latest idea, however, was the most controversial yet: installing a camera inside a coffin to record what happened after burial. "This isn't about superstition or creating fear," Dr. Walker said passionately during a meeting with his skeptical colleagues. "This is about understanding the unseen processes of nature. Think of what this could mean for forensic science, environmental studies, or even archaeology. We have never directly observed what happens in such a confined environment." Despite his enthusiasm, the room fell silent. Many of his peers exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't every day that a respected scientist proposed such a bold and morbid experiment. "You're asking us to disturb the sanctity of burial," one colleague argued. "People won't accept this." But James was determined. "This isn't disrespectful," he countered. "This is science, and we will ensure it's done ethically with full consent." Months of heated debates followed. Ethics boards rejected the project repeatedly, religious groups protested the very idea, and even James's own team had doubts. Yet he didn't give up. He refined his proposal, addressed every concern, and reached out to private donors willing to fund the project. Finally, approval came, with one strict condition: a willing volunteer. That's when Henry Roberts entered the story. A retired high school teacher and lifelong supporter of science, Henry was in the final stages of a terminal illness. When approached with the idea, he listened carefully before responding with a calm smile. "I've taught students about the wonders of science my entire life," Henry said. "If my body can help uncover something new, why not? I've lived a full life and I want to leave something meaningful behind." His words deeply moved Dr. Walker's team. Henry wasn't just a participant, he was a partner in their quest for discovery. The day of Henry's burial arrived. It was a bright sunny morning with the scent of fresh flowers drifting in the air. His family gathered at the cemetery, their emotions a mix of sorrow and pride. They knew Henry's decision was unconventional, but they respected his choice. His daughter placed a single white rose on the coffin as it was lowered into the ground. Standing at a respectful distance, Dr. Walker and his team quietly observed. Their equipment had been carefully prepared, a small high-definition camera discreetly installed inside the coffin, along with sensors to monitor temperature, oxygen levels, and vibrations. Every precaution had been taken to ensure the setup was secure and non-intrusive. Back at the lab, the team gathered around a row of glowing monitors. The live feed from the camera displayed the interior of the coffin, soft white fabric lining the walls, perfectly still and serene. The sensors showed normal readings, and the equipment hummed softly, ready to capture data. Dr. Walker looked at his team, his expression serious yet hopeful. "This is it," he said. "We're about to witness something no one has ever seen before. Let's document everything and stay focused." The experiment had officially begun. The atmosphere in the lab was one of anticipation. The team, led by Dr. James Walker, sat at their stations, their eyes fixed on the monitors displaying the live feed from inside the coffin. The camera's view showed the soft white fabric lining, completely still, creating an eerie sense of calm. It was almost like looking into another world, one untouched by time. Lisa, a junior researcher, broke the silence. "It feels strange, doesn't it? Watching this, knowing what's inside?" Dr. Walker glanced at her, his tone calm but firm. "It may feel unusual, but this is science. We're here to observe and learn." The first few hours passed without incident. The live feed showed no changes, and the sensors continued to record stable readings, temperature, oxygen levels, and humidity, all normal. The lab's air conditioning hummed softly in the background, the only sound breaking the stillness. Daniel, the lead technician, monitored the data carefully. "Everything looks as expected so far," he said, logging the sensor readings into the system. "No signs of movement or activity." The team nodded, but the stillness wasn't entirely comforting. There was a strange tension in the air, as though they were waiting for something they couldn't quite define. The more they stared at the unchanging image on the screen, the heavier the silence felt. "Nature takes time," Dr. Walker reminded them. "We're unlikely to see anything significant for several hours, maybe even days. Patience is key." Despite his reassurances, the room remained tense. Each scientist was lost in their thoughts, wondering what they might witness over the coming hours. They were scientists, yes, but they were also human, and the idea of watching what happened in a confined coffin underground carried an unshakable unease. At the 6-hour mark, Daniel's brow furrowed. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he replayed a section of the feed. "Did anyone see that?" he asked softly. Lisa turned to him. "See what?" "There, at the edge of the screen," Daniel said, rewinding the footage frame by frame. The team crowded around his station, their curiosity reignited. At first, the footage looked exactly as it had for hours, still, peaceful and undisturbed. But then they saw it, a faint flicker near the corner of the screen. "What was that?" Lisa asked, her voice tinged with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "Could it be interference?" Dr. Walker suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Daniel shook his head. "This equipment is state-of-the-art. It's designed to filter out interference, and besides, this doesn't look like a technical glitch." He zoomed in and slowed the footage further. The flicker was barely perceptible, but it was there, a brief, almost imperceptible movement at the edge of the screen. Dr. Walker straightened. "Log it," he instructed. "Note the time and details. It could be nothing, but it's worth documenting." The room fell silent once more as the team resumed their monitoring. The flicker, though brief, had left a lingering sense of unease. It was the first sign that something unexpected might be happening. Hours passed, and the live feed returned to its earlier stillness. But the tension in the lab had shifted. The team couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer simply observing nature. They were witnessing something they didn't yet understand. Dr. Walker sat at his desk, reviewing the footage again and again. The flicker might have been minor, but it had stirred a sense of anticipation in him. He glanced at the clock on the wall. The experiment was still in its early stages, but deep down, he felt it. This was only the beginning. Couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. What if they weren't just observing nature? What if something or someone was trying to reach out to them? By the 24th hour, the tension in the lab had reached its peak. The tapping sounds and faint voice had left the team shaken, but their scientific training kept them going. They logged every detail with precision, though an unspoken unease lingered in the room. The coffin feed on the monitor remained still, the burial shroud undisturbed, but no one could ignore the sense that something else was about to happen. Lisa broke the silence, her voice low. "Do you think we'll hear it again, the voice?" Dr. Walker didn't look up from his notes. "It's possible," he said. "But let's focus on what we can verify. Sounds, movements, data. Those are our priorities." Daniel, who had been replaying the earlier footage, suddenly froze. His hand hovered over the keyboard as he stared at the monitor. "Dr. Walker, something's happening again." Everyone's head snapped toward the screen. At first glance, the coffin interior looked the same as before, silent and still. But as they watched, the burial shroud began to shift. This time, the movement wasn't subtle. The fabric bunched slightly in the middle, as though being pushed from beneath, then smoothed itself out again. The entire team leaned in closer, their breaths held as the shroud moved once more, this time dragging slightly to one side. "That's impossible," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "There's no airflow, no external force. How is it moving?" Dr. Walker's expression remained neutral, though his mind was racing. "Replay it," he said calmly. Daniel rewound the footage and played it back in slow motion, frame by frame. The shroud's movement was clear and deliberate. There was no sign of what had caused it, no visible disturbance, no vibration, no external interference. "It's not natural," Daniel muttered. "It's like something's underneath it." The words hung in the air, heavy and unnerving. Dr. Walker straightened, his tone firm. "Log the time and details. Check the sensor data for any changes. Pressure, temperature, anything." The team worked quickly, their hands shaking slightly as they reviewed the data. But the readings showed nothing unusual. The coffin remained sealed, the environment unchanged. There was no scientific explanation for the movement they had just witnessed. Lisa glanced at Dr. Walker, her face pale. Could it be a biological reaction, something we don't understand about decomposition? Dr. Walker hesitated before replying. "It's possible," he said carefully. "Gases released during decomposition could cause slight movements, but nothing like this. This is deliberate." The lab fell silent again as the team returned their focus to the monitor. The shroud remained still, its earlier movements now a haunting memory. But the sense of unease in the room only grew stronger. It felt as though the stillness wasn't an end, it was a pause. a moment of calm before the next wave of the unknown. Dr. Walker sat back in his chair, his thoughts racing. He had entered this experiment with clear objectives, to observe and document the natural processes of burial. But now, it felt as though they were on the verge of something far greater, something that defied logic and science. As the clock ticked on, the room remained tense, each member of the team silently bracing themselves for what might come next. Whatever was happening inside the coffin, it wasn't over. By the 36th hour, exhaustion had begun to creep into the lab, but none of the scientists dared to leave their stations. The earlier events, the tapping, the voice, and the shroud's movement, played on a loop in their minds, leaving them anxious and alert. Every monitor in the room seemed to hum with anticipation, as though something unseen was building toward a climax. Lisa sat with her notebook open, her pen idle. "Do you think we're recording something beyond science?" she asked quietly, almost as if afraid to voice her thoughts. Dr. Walker, standing by the main monitor, remained calm on the outside, though his thoughts mirrored Lisa's unease. "Let's not speculate," he replied, his tone measured. "Our job is to document what we observe. Whatever this is, we let the data speak for itself." But deep down, even Dr. Walker felt the weight of the unknown. This experiment was no longer just about science. It was about confronting something no one had ever expected to see. Suddenly, the live feed flickered. The screen flashed black for a moment, sending a jolt of alarm through the room. When the image returned, everything seemed normal at first, until Daniel pointed at the monitor. "Look at the shroud," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. The shroud, which had been perfectly still since its last movement, now appeared bunched along one edge. But what caught their attention most wasn't the fabric. It was the wooden lid of the coffin above it. Slowly, faint letters began to form on the surface, as though etched by an invisible hand. "Is that writing?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The team leaned closer to the screen, their eyes wide with shock. The letters became clearer with each passing second, forming a single word. "FRE." Dr. Walker's heart raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. "Zoom in," he ordered, his voice sharp but steady. Daniel enhanced the image, and the words stood out starkly against the dark wood. It wasn't carved or scratched. It looked as though it had been written in condensation or fine dust. The letters glowed faintly in the light from the camera, their presence both eerie and undeniable. "Log this immediately," Dr. Walker said, his tone firm. "Time, image clarity, everything." Lisa's hands trembled as she jotted down notes. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Why would it say that?" Dr. Walker didn't reply. He was too focused on the monitor, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. The word lingered on the coffin lid for several minutes before it began to fade, as though whatever had created it was retreating. The silence in the lab was broken only by the soft hum of the equipment. Every member of the team stared at the screen, waiting for something else to happen. But the coffin's interior remained still, its earlier activity now replaced by an eerie calm. And then, just as they thought the event had passed, the audio feed crackled to life. At first it was just static, faint and distorted. But slowly the sound became clearer, resolving into a voice. A soft, deliberate whisper that filled the room. "Thank you," it said. The voice was calm, almost peaceful, but its presence sent chills through the team. It was unmistakably human, yet it defied all logic. The words echoed in the quiet lab, their simplicity carrying a weight that none of the scientists could fully comprehend. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the voice faded. The monitors flickered one final time before the feed went completely dark. Daniel scrambled to restore the connection, his hands flying across the keyboard. "The camera's offline," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's not responding." Dr. Walker stared at the blank screen, his expression unreadable. He knew the experiment was over, but the questions it had raised would haunt them for a long time. "Document everything," he said quietly. "Every sound, every image. We need to analyze this from every angle." But even as he spoke, he knew there were some mysteries that data couldn't explain. The word "free." The voice's final "thank you." These weren't just scientific anomalies. They were something deeper, something that transcended logic and reason. As the team sat in silence, Dr. Walker allowed himself a moment of reflection. Whatever they had witnessed, it wasn't just about decomposition or environmental processes. It was about life, death, and the thin, fragile line between the two.